Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a beautiful day here in Durham. On behalf of the Zeidman family and the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy, I'd like to welcome you to the John Fisher Zeidman Memorial Colloquium on Politics and the Press. My name is Philip Bennett. I'm a professor here at the Sanford School of Public Policy. This event is dedicated to the memory of a Duke student, John Fisher Zeidman, class of 1983, who developed his interest in politics and the press while studying at Duke. John Zeidman was intensely engaged with the world and recognized the news media's influence in shaping the country's politics. Today marks the 20th time that this event has been held. We are grateful to the Zeidman family, whose expression of love for their son made this continuing conversation about politics and the press an enduring gift to our community. Let's take this opportunity to thank the Zeidman family. Try to make that not happen too often. So the last time we met, it was in that far away land called 2008. President Obama had been elected. The Obama campaign appeared to announce, if not a new era of politics, then a revolution in political coverage, one that seemed to challenge core assumptions about journalism. We've just witnessed another historic electoral upheaval. What are its lessons for the press and the country? Are they different from those in 2008? And where will they lead us? We're very fortunate today to have an exceptional panel with us to guide us through this wilderness. I'm going to introduce them and then ask each panelist to share some reflections for about 15 minutes. Then we'll open the floor to you for questions. John Harris, who's here on my right, is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Politico, which has performed a sort of unilateral redistricting of the map of political journalism since John started it together with Jim Vandehei in 2007. John had a distinguished 21-year career at the Washington Post, where he covered Virginia politics, the military, and then became an ace White House correspondent during the Clinton administration and the newspaper's national politics editor. At Politico.com, John famously manages a deadline every 30 seconds. As a former colleague of his at the Post, I will tell you that back in the day when there was only one deadline every 24 hours, that for the newspaper, John could terrify his editors when up to the last minute you could see him sitting at his desk in this classic pose. He would have one foot up on his desk, he'd be leaning backwards with his tie loosened, and he'd be sort of casually fingering the keyboard while balancing the phone under on his shoulder. And just when you thought all was lost, he'd hit the button and boom, you would have this very elegant, beautifully written page one story. John is the author of the books The Survivor, Bill Clinton in the White House, and The Way to Win, which he wrote with Mark Halperin. Sunshine Hillygus joined the Duke faculty last year and is as an associate professor of political science. Her research and teaching specialties include public opinion, political behavior, survey research, campaigns and elections, and information technology and society. Sunshine is the author of The Persuadable Voter, Wedge Issues in Political Campaigns, which was published in 2008, and The Hard Count, The Social and Political Challenges of the 2000 Census. She arrived at Duke from Harvard University, where she was an associate professor of government and founding director of the program on survey research. She received her PhD from Sanford University, and as you will discover if you visit her website, is a proud booster of her hometown University of Arkansas Razorbacks. John King is the anchor of John King USA, CNN's 7 p.m. weeknight newscast, or public affairs and politics show, and is the network's chief national correspondent. John was CNN's senior White House correspondent from 1999 to 2005 and has reported on a variety of major national and international stories, including the Iraq War. He has covered 6 presidential campaigns, And in 2008, he introduced the Jedi arts of CNN's Magic Wall to election viewers and digital and data visualization groupies everywhere. There's also something, although I can assure you that this is him sitting right here.
I am not a hologram.
There's also something old school in John's journalism. He started as an intern in the Providence Bureau of the Associated Press and went on to lead the AP's political coverage of the 1992 and 96 presidential elections. After launching the State of the Union with John King on CNN in 2009, he reported from all 50 states during President Obama's first year in office. In other words, he's a cable news anchor that even Ted Koppel could love. And so, John, why don't we start with you? You can get us started this afternoon.
That's such a nice intro. I don't get those that often. I should probably quit while I'm ahead. Let me take a few minutes first to thank the Zeidman family and the university for having me here. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. And I'll try not to take all 15 minutes. I remember that Harris pose. He used to do that in the White House briefing room, too. He's a relaxed guy. I'll offer you my observations, a few lessons of the midterms, if you will, to try to give you a sense of, anyway, what my reporting tells me where we are today, and then hopefully it won't take too much time and we'll have some questions. The first thing I would say, and it plays right out of the point Phil just made about the last time you had this conversation, is don't overread what just happened. You know, 2 years ago it was wow. Historic election, the first African-American president, more Democratic gains after the 2006 election, building on the 2008 election, and the conversation was Obama and the Democrats have reshaped and rewritten and recolored the map of American politics. 9 red states turned blue. It was a Democratic era. The next 25 years would be dominated by the Democrats, and now we sit around quoting Sarah Palin saying, how's that hopey-changey thing going? There's a great volatility in the American electorate right now, and so as we discuss what just happened, I would not pour any cement. There's a restiveness in the country that is fascinating if you do what I do for a living. It's also very consequential in terms of the major policy discussions we maybe should have been having for the last 5 years or 15 years or 20 years, and that we should be having in the next 2 to 4 years. So I wouldn't read too much into it. Yet at the same time, and this is a bit of a contradiction, what just happened is very, 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 very significant. You have a Republican House of Representatives. You have essentially parity in the United States Senate because of the rules. The Democrats have the majority, but they can't do anything. Anything. They really can't even go to the restroom without the Republicans' cooperation because of the rules of the building. And you have huge gains, and this is often ignored by people who live in the town I live in, huge gains, probably even more important than what's happened in Washington at the state level. The Republicans not only made big gains in the net number of governorships they control, but look at where they picked them up. The Democrats still control California, New York, Illinois, and I'll add Colorado because it's growing as an influential swing state when it comes to presidential politics. That's good for the Democrats. They're going to need to protect those because if you look at the map now, of course the Republicans kept Texas, but they have Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. They held Florida. They got Nevada. They got New Mexico. And last year they got Virginia and New Jersey. That's a big piece of the pie. That's a huge piece of the pie. And it matters now more than it would matter, say, 2 years ago or 2 years from now because we're coming out of the census and we do redistricting. And not only did they pick up all those governorships, they picked up 700 state legislative seats and flipped a lot of chambers. I think 19 chambers flipped from Democratic control to Republican control. So they're writing the rules. They're writing a lot of the rules, not just in Washington, but in a lot of the big swing states and influential states across the country. And so that gives them immediate power now, and those 700 or so, that's a rough number, legislators gives them a bench. Those are future congressmen, future governors, future candidates for president that we don't know their names right now, but somebody will be sitting here in 20 years talking about one of them or 2 of them or 10 of them. And it's a very, very important development. That remap is a big deal, and we don't know what it's going to look like right now. So I would argue this is the America we live in. The issues portfolio, high unemployment, unhappiness with Obama and or the Democratic agenda, or at least how they implemented that agenda, that favors the Republicans. Yet the demographics of America as people now vote, favor the Democrats. And that is mostly, not solely, but mostly in part because the fastest growing segment of our population, Latinos, even in this past election, overwhelmingly voted for the Democrats. And their fastest growth comes in some of those very important swing states I just mentioned. And it doesn't have to be, they don't have to be 10 or 15 or 20% of the vote, which they are in some states, and it's growing. It can be 4 or 5% of the vote if it's a 50-50 race. It's a very close race. So even here in North Carolina, that is a segment of the population that in a very competitive race can be a swing, the swing vote for the next 2 to 5, maybe 10 years, we don't know. So you have these competing interests in the short term and long term in our politics. The question is, there's also a huge opportunity for the Republicans. I'm fascinated by demographics, I always have been, and the party that, if a party can keep the affinity of the Latino vote for the next 10 or 15 years, they will come to dominate American politics in the short term. And right now that's the Democrats, which seems a bit odd given the recent setbacks, but right now it is. And yet the Pew Hispanic Center just did a fascinating study asking Latinos in America, who is your leader? They don't have one. More than 6 in 10 said, I don't know. And the people who did get named had 2% or 5%. A guy in my business, Jorge Ramos, is a friend of mine, he got 2%. So there's a huge opportunity, even though the Republicans have been viewed as on the wrong sides of the issues, and the big issue has been the immigration debate in the country the last few years, the Republicans have been penalized for their tone, if not their policy position on that. There's a great opportunity for them right out of an election where they just elected a Cuban-American senator from the state of Florida who has great communication skills and high ambition, and more importantly to me, Hispanic governors of Nevada and New Mexico. If you don't know the name Susana Martinez, you will in the next 2 to 5 years, because she has an opportunity to be a huge player in the competition for this vote. And the Democrats have it now, but they should be very frightened by the fact that this constituency does not see a leader. So there's an open competition, and it's one of the fascinating dynamics in American politics. The Republicans, though, have a lot of challenges, and they're not dissimilar to the challenges that the president has had for the last 2 years and will have for the next 2 years. When you grow, think about it as Thanksgiving or family reunion. The more people in the room, the more interesting the arguments, and the harder it is to please everybody. The Republicans now have that problem. They won an election in which a lot of the energy and ground support came from the Tea Party and a revival of some traditional Republican voters. They want the Republican Party to stand up to the president, to fight the president, to repeal the health care bill, to stop the spending, and to try to put Washington on some path to fiscal sanity. But the Republicans won in the end because the independent voters, the very same voters that gave Obama North Carolina and Virginia and Colorado, swung back. They want very different things than the base of the Republican Party. So the challenge for Speaker Boehner is going to be, how do you keep your base with you? And if you have watched their early moves in the 2 weeks since the election, they understand that. George W. Bush and the Republican Party lost the base. That's why they lost 2006. That's why they were blown out in 2008. So their immediate lesson has been, don't lose the base again. But if they over-focus on don't losing the base, they will lose that middle. And so how they manage this bigger family is a fascinating challenge. And the president has had it for the past 2 years. A lot of independents think the health care bill is too much government, or they think that maybe I like the health care bill, but you spent 8 months on that and you should have been fighting for jobs. For different reasons, he lost a lot of the middle of America. And as he did that, many of you have seen this, he's also fighting with his own base, because some of them are still violently mad. He didn't fight for single payer, even though he didn't have the votes for single payer. They still think he should have fought for single payer. They don't want to be in Afghanistan. So he has problems too. So now you have both parties and their leaders trying to deal with very volatile, feisty, and restive constituencies. Is the Tea Party for real? It is now. Is it in 2 or 4 years? I go back to the point I made at the beginning. There's no cement poured right now. We will see. Another factor for the Republicans is that there aren't, you can count on one hand the number of Republicans who won elections this year saying we're going to fight about abortion and same-sex marriage and stem cells and other cultural issues. However, now that they have that power, the interest groups and the organizations within their party that care about those issues say, we have the numbers, let's do something with it. And they will pressure people, whether it's the next Supreme Court nomination or whether it's, watch at the state level, the number of states that try to copy the Arizona immigration law or that try to copy a new Nebraska abortion law that moves essentially viability back 2 or 3 weeks. You're going to see a lot of this going on in the states. The states will be more important than Washington in some ways. Let me close with a minute looking ahead to the campaign that's already begun, which is the next one. And we always cover the next one based on what happened in the last one, and we will do that because that's the way we do things, but I think we will do it at our peril. The president has a challenge. Is the message of this election to move to the center? Whether it is or it isn't, he has no choice on some issues. The Republicans have power in Washington, and if he wants to do business with them, he's going to have to move on some issues. However, when he runs for re-election, he needs to try to find a way to recreate what we now know was an Obama movement, not a Democratic movement in 2008. A lot of the people who didn't show up this time, the question is, we know they're not fiercely loyal to the Democratic Party. We're about to find out if they're fiercely loyal to him. They were 2 years ago. He needs them next time. What does he have to do to make them come and play? And yet he needs to steal that very same middle back from the Republicans. They just took it from him. He needs to steal it back. This is a turnover in a Razorback game. In the end, this is the football that you got to take away from the other guy. That's the independent voters. And how do you do that when you've got to motivate your base at the very same time? It's a huge challenge, especially when he faces big decisions about whether to cave on taxes. He's going to stay in Afghanistan. He's not going to get, the troops aren't coming out in 2011. If you think they are, you're not paying attention. So he has some issues there. I am fascinated by whether, because of all this, my big question about American politics is, will we continue to live? It's great if you're a political journalist. It's depressing if you're a citizen in the world of everything is done based on the short-term political calculation. Who is going to win the next election based on this decision? And I'll say that in close on this, to this point, the President's Deficit Commission, one of the co-chairmen is a friend of yours here in North Carolina, Erskine Bowles, just put on the table what is a very provocative and bold proposal. I don't pretend to be smart enough to know whether they're right in the way they do these things, but they made everybody mad, which suggests to me that they're onto something. And yet, the reaction was, the left said, no way, dead on arrival, it touches Social Security, it touches Medicare, no. The right said, no way, dead on arrival, it in the end raises taxes, gives the government more revenue, no way. If we run into our ideological bunkers like that, we can't have an adult conversation about very big and important things. That is Washington, D.C. I call it the world's largest, most dysfunctional daycare center. But the country has a problem. I mean, the country has a problem in the sense that the margins are so close that Obama can win, that the Republicans can take it back, that nobody feels that they have the political breathing space to do big, risky things. The president just did it on health care. 50-year fight for the Democratic Party. He did it, and he paid a price. He paid a price, and some of you in this room think it was probably a great thing to do. Some of you might think it was a horrible thing to do. As a student of politics, good for him for having the courage. He's not a dumb man, whether you like him or don't like him. He's a very smart man. He knew the risks, and he did it. But now that he has paid the price, can you get them back into the room to do something big again? Can you get the Republican Party that just for the first time in a long time won a huge edge among senior voters, elderly voters in America, the most reliable voting bloc in America? The Republicans won them by a big number. That's rare. Are they going to sit down? They have been the ones for the last 5 years saying you have to reform Medicare and Social Security or else you can't do it. The math doesn't work. The Democrats have said, well, you got to raise taxes too. But just focus on that for a minute. Now that they got the senior vote, will they hold that position? And will they sit down and say you have to put Medicare and Social Security on the table? Or will they say, no way, not before the next election, not doing that? And so that is where we are in a very dysfunctional system in which I'm fascinated by the next campaign. And the first chapter of that is the fight for the Republican nomination. And we were just having this conversation upstairs, and I'll shut up after this, and that 6 months ago, anybody close to Sarah Palin would have told you she probably won't run, she's just going to have some fun with this and have some influence over this. But after this last campaign, where she had a lot more influence than I think even she could have imagined, why not? Why not? She's got as good a chance as anybody, whether you think that's a great proposition or a frightening proposition. She has as good a chance as anybody, and a better chance than most, to be the next Republican nominee for president, and that's a hard thing to pass up. And if you get in a one-on-one race against the President of the United States, you got a 50-50 chance of being the leader of the free world. That's a hard thing to walk away from, isn't it? I'll stop there.
Professor Hillygus.
Thank you, and I want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak today. And let me be clear on what I believe my role is. I'm flanked by people who are spending their days really immersed in the politics of the moment, but as a political scientist, my job doesn't start until the election is over. So I'm just now starting to analyze the data, and in that sense, by the time we have a strong sense of what we think what happened in the election, everyone will have moved on. But let me give some thoughts based on political science research coming into 2010 about what I think happened in this election cycle and what it means for the next one. First, there was a lot of discussion in the media about this was all about Sarah Palin, this was about Citizens United and the influx of money. And I would say that political science models historically have been able to predict 80% of the change in House seats from one election to the next on the basis of three things: the state of the economy, presidential approval, and the number of seats the majority already held. So you might say, wait a second, how is it that Obama is getting the blame for the economy? On the one hand, for some of you are saying, well, really it was Bush's fault, and other of you are saying, really the president doesn't have all that much control over the economy. And what I want to remind you of is what the economy does is it places constraints on the messages that you can run on in the campaign. It makes it easier to recruit strong candidates from the opposition. So that it's not about people necessarily saying that the president is to blame. It is all of the things that go along with the state of the economy. In terms of approval, I would just say that approval equals the economy in a lot of respects. And then it is the number of seats that the majority already held. And here I would just say in a lot of respects the Democrats are having a hangover from 2008. There were a lot of seats that they did better than expected, districts that they wouldn't have normally won. I think 48 congressional districts where Democrats won, but the district voted for McCain for president. Those were seats that no matter what's going on, that you would expect to flip in a midterm. So the second point that I would say is another story we have seen a lot is about the role of independents in this election cycle. And that Obama better start moving to the center. He needs to really focus on bipartisanship because those independents that had supported him in 2008 now voted Republican in 2010. And I would say not so fast, for a few different reasons. We tend to focus on independents as a single group, right? That they're moving from one side to another, and they have moderate opinions, and that can't be further from the truth. In fact, there are a lot of independents who are, in fact, we call them closet partisans, and so we kind of have to take them out of the mix when we're talking about independents. There are a lot of independents who actually don't show up to vote, and so if you just do a poll and you want to talk about the opinions of independents, the candidates themselves shouldn't be perhaps too focused on those who aren't really going to turn up election day. And then if you look at the pool of people who truly are independents, truly are kind of susceptible to influence, they have a wide and diverse set of preferences. They agree with the Republican Party on some issues, the Democratic Party on other issues, and there is not a single profile of the independent voter. And so if we're going to look at kind of what the president and the Congress should be doing to appeal to independents, you just can't think about them as a single group. So another point I would maybe counter some of the media stories would be on the Citizens United case. There was a lot of discussion about how Citizens United fundamentally shaped the amount of money in the campaign and had a profound influence. And it's not to say that there wasn't an increase from 2006. There certainly was. By a very dramatic amount, outside groups were spending quite a bit more. On the other hand, I think total spending in the election cycle by all groups, candidates included, was about $4 billion. We spent $2 billion on Halloween candy. It might be worth keeping in perspective, right? We're talking about elections, who's running this is information. Political scientists tend to think about money as a way of communicating information about the race to individual voters. And Halloween candy is a nice marker, I think. The other thing I would say is that while there was a lot of talk about how Citizens United would allow corporations to really promote Republicans in particular, that what we found is that the spending by outside groups was fairly even between the two sides. Moreover, they were spending money in races that were already saturated. Right, so in terms of where they were spending their money in races where the candidates themselves are spending lots of money, and so it's unlikely that they had a tremendous influence. And then finally, I would say with regard to money is that there has been a tremendous amount of political science research trying to figure out how much campaign spending influences election outcomes or the behavior of those who are elected, and often comes down on the side that not as much as we might think. Ask Meg Whitman how much campaign spending can buy an election. Finally, let me just say a word about polling in this election cycle. Here, I think that as a conversation we had over brunch, there was incredible variability in the quality of polling and the reporting on that polling. My friend, ABC pollster Gary Langer, likes to say that the media has the lazy luxury of being both data hungry and math phobic, and that there is a tendency to chase those numbers simply because it gives some authority to what they want to say and some legitimacy to the story. And yet there are junk polls and there are quality polls, and so since I have a couple of you guys on the panel, I'd say there ought to be much greater attention to the variability in polling quality. And I think a classic example is that Rasmussen this time was really shown to have a pretty considerable bias. And those are the type things that I think media organizations need to be more conscientious because there are case after case in recent years of polling scandals because there are so many different polling opportunities out there. Okay, so one last thing. I know I said that was the final thing, but let me just say one more thing, and that is about looking ahead. And here I just want to second the thing, John's comments, because if we're to think about what this election means for the 2012 presidential election, I would say that voters in 2012 are going to be thinking about 2012. And so we can speculate right now, but at the end of the day, it is a new election. And if the economy is doing better, then Obama's chances look much different from how they look if the economy has not recovered. And over.
Great. Thank you.
Well, I'm also delighted to be down here. I wanted to thank the Zeidman family for putting together not just today's event, but it's now 20 years of, it sounds like very, very worthwhile events. It's great to be in this wonderful space, which I never have before, even though I'm well acquainted with the Sanford School. To accept Phil's invitation to come down here was the least I could do after giving him so many white-knuckle moments over the years on deadline. Phil mentioned a book I co-wrote with Mark Halperin, who I believe has also been here at the Zeidman Colloquium. Mark's been a very successful author co-author of his book. He's sold over 1 million copies. Fortunately for him, unfortunately for me, 990,000 of those books that Mark has co-authored have not been with me. That was with his book, Game Change, with John Heilman. 10,000 of the books, of the 1 million books that he sold, were with me. The two of us wrote a book, as Bill mentioned, called The Way to Win. Came out about 4 years ago. And the conceit of that book was that I had spent a lot of time covering the Clinton White House. I knew the Clinton political operation probably as well as anybody, maybe the possible exception of John King. I say I still know it almost as well as anybody. It's declining currency. It's kind of like Confederate script.
Don't be so sure.
Not that much value in knowing the Clinton political operation, but I do. I knew the Clinton side of how they saw the world. Mark was very well versed in how George W. Bush's political operation worked, in particular knew Karl Rove very well. And we said, look, if you could put the 2008 election will take place within the sort of strategic precepts that those two sort of political dynasties, the Bush dynasty and the Clinton dynasty, have built in American politics. And so our book was an effort to help people understand what was going to happen in the 2008 presidential election based on the history that we understood well. And as a predictive venture, it didn't do terribly well. You can look through all 400 pages of that book, and one name you don't find is Barack Obama. So we were a little off on that. There was one part of that book that I felt that we have been somewhat vindicated on, and it's relevant to our conversation today. And much of what I'm going to say, I think, will echo, or at least flow from what John and Sunshine have said. One question we tried to grapple with in that book is, why do we have a politics which has become so polarized, in which so much of the discourse lurches toward the extremes, in which so many politicians and so many people in the media sort of practice a brand of discourse which is about sharpening lines rather than about coming to the middle and actually solving problems that are in the public interest. Why is that? And our answer to that was we came up with a name why American politics, in our view, had become a freak show. And that's a contemptuous name for a phenomenon toward which we felt contempt. And it was our conclusion that American politics had become a freak show, not by accident, but for some very specific reasons. There are incentives in our political system and in our media that send politics in this direction. What are the incentives that we're talking about? Really, in politics, and for that matter in media, when it comes to coverage of politics, there's two big incentives, only two that I can think of. One is publicity, the other is money. Politicians crave publicity. People that run media organizations crave publicity. Also money. You can't succeed in politics, you can't succeed in media unless you're generating money. Those two incentives in our politics today, in our political discourse today, send people toward the extremes and away from the incentive, away from the center. The best illustration that I can think of on this makes the point is, you guys all remember the fellow Joe Wilson. He's the congressman that in the middle of Obama's speech in 2009, apparently his emotions got the better of him. He shouted out, "You lied." Now, I run a publication that covers Capitol Hill. I'll confess that before he did that, I did not know who Joe Wilson was. He was the epitome of a backbencher. And when Joe Wilson blurted out, "You lie," on national TV, at first even he was embarrassed by what he had done. He felt he had made a jerk of himself and he had apologized. That was within the first hour or two. Within the next several hours, look what happened. All of a sudden, money is flooding into his campaign committee. Hey, I want to give money to this guy. I like the way he told Obama off. That's one of the incentives. Publicity. I guess John was still doing his show at that time. I don't know if he was on the Sunday, on CNN's Sunday show. I do know that he was on several. He was definitely on Fox News Sunday, the following Sunday. All of a sudden, invitations are coming in to Joe Wilson to get publicity. There you have the two incentives in action, rewarding extreme behavior. He's a formerly obscure guy, now famous. Again, he's rolling in campaign contributions. Those are the freak show's incentives in action. And there's lots and lots of examples on both sides of the political spectrum that support this. Michelle Bachmann, the congresswoman, and here, Ms. Zeidman rolls her eyes there, betraying her own feelings about this. Michelle Bachmann, the outspoken congresswoman from Minnesota. She's rolling in money, all kinds of people, because they like the things she says and her flamboyant style, her penchant for outrageous statements, or at least statements stated in the extreme, causes people from far outside Minnesota to identify with her. They want to support her. They send her money. On the Democratic side, he's now a former congressman, or about to be former, Alan Grayson from Florida. He was one of the best, most well-funded congressmen, in part because he was frequently saying outlandish things about conservatives. People who are liberals loved it. They'd send in checks. That's what I mean by the freak show. And the freak show is an element of our politics that has survived, and I think was in fact a big factor in the politics of 2010. I want to go back in a couple of years, in 2008, I guess this was the last of these colloquiums, in 2008, and look back at what we thought then, and not just we in the media, but I think we throughout the sort of political world. John, quite rightly, I think, admonished us to not overread the results of elections, but I think one of those admonitions probably would go to the Obama White House, which also overread the results of the election. Here's what they thought in 2008, and I know it's what they thought because I had numerous conversations with the gang around Barack Obama about this. One is that Barack Obama thought that by getting elected, and getting elected the way he got elected in 2008, he had proven that he could transcend what Mark and I called the freak show. He's got a unique ability to inspire, a unique ability to rise above divisions, the power of his personality, the power of his biography, the power of his rational mind and detached mind that can separate himself from the extreme emotions. That gave him unique ability to both unite the country and also insulate himself from the sort of wild media pressures that we called the freak show. That was one thing he believed. The other thing he believed is that the 2008 election showed that the ideological center of the country had shifted. We were no longer the country that we were, say, when I covered the White House during the Clinton years. That's something really interesting, by the way, about the Obama crowd, at least then, changing their tune a little bit now. They thought that Barack Obama's election was a reversal, not just of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney. That's obviously a very sort of obvious fact. But if you talk to them privately, I'm struck by the degree of contempt they felt toward Bill Clinton. And they saw their election as just as much a reversal of the politics of Clintonism as it was the politics of Bushism. In other words, Bill Clinton was a defensive politician. He didn't get anything big done because he was so much in a defensive crouch. He was so much governing from the assumption that this is a center-right country and you can't, as a progressive politician, do big things. That's what they thought. Many of the things they did in 2009 and 2010 flowed from this premise. That's why they felt they were confident to pass health care, why they felt they could pass in the first year under their so-called Big Bang, which didn't come to full fruition, pass cap-and-trade legislation to deal with global warming. A big, expansive agenda all flows from the belief, hey, this is a different country. Now, I don't really fault them for overreading the elections, because I must say, to some extent, I did myself. I thought something big had happened in 2008 when you've got a Democratic politician, Democratic presidential candidate winning North Carolina, winning the state where I started my political reporting career, Virginia. That hadn't been done since Lyndon Johnson in 1964, winning a state in the Midwest like Indiana. Something big has happened. Maybe Barack Obama's right. The center of gravity has shifted. I think what we see is that that is a big mistake, and that perhaps long term the center of gravity of the country has shifted, but it's clearly not true in the short term. One of the things Barack Obama, and I would say the whole Democratic Party, learned in this election is that Bill Clinton was on to something. Fundamentally want to know what Bill Clinton believes is if you are a progressive, you want to be a progressive in this country, you have to practice what I call the politics of reassurance. What's that mean? At the ideological level, you have to reassure people that you're not a liberal or a European-style socialist or a crazy liberal, that in fact you believe in activist government, but it's modest government that has tangible benefits that will flow directly to you. Ideological reassurance. Hey, you don't have to be scared of my agenda. It's something that's good for you, and it's not going to transform the country in incremental ways. It's going to make your life better. You also have to practice the politics of personal reassurance. Hey, I'm like you. My values are your values. You can relate to me. I don't think Barack Obama has done that in the first couple of years of his term as nearly as well as he should have. And the Democrats have not also not done that. These two factors, the fact that he did not practice the politics of reassurance to the center, and I accept Sunshine's point that we can't think of independents as a monolithic block. They're in fact a collection of different groups. But collectively, you can look at polls, and independent voters have taken flight from Democrats and the Democratic agenda. And at the same time, the freak show was not declared dead in 2008. In fact, it's become ever and ever more powerful in being able to excite the extremes on both sides. And in this case, it especially excited the extremes on the right. So what happened in the 2010 elections? You've got a Republican or conservative base that's in overdrive, combining with and which hates Barack Obama, hates Nancy Pelosi, hates the Democratic agenda. They're in overdrive. And you've got a group in the middle that I don't believe hates Barack Obama. The polling doesn't support that it does, but nonetheless is extremely anxious. So a hyper energized base combined with a center group or a diverse set of groups of independents who are nervous about the direction of the country. That leads to a very, very big night for Republicans. This is noteworthy. Ordinarily, the more energized the ideological wing of either party is, the more the center is turned off. Classic example of this is, John mentioned it, if you've got conservatives who are really hyped up about cultural issues, and they're being driven to the polls by opposition to abortion or gay marriage or gun control or what have you, that works to energize their base, but the center says, whoa, wait a minute, I'm just not comfortable with that extremism. I believe in this election, the concerns of the center and the concerns of the conservative base reinforced one another. That is, it was not fundamentally about cultural issues. It was about the economic issues and anxiety about the size of government, the expense of government, the magnitude of the debt. Those concerns among independents and the conservative base largely overlapped. Both were worried about the same thing. So there wasn't this natural tension. I believe that's what drove the electorate. And I definitely agree with the point about this all happens within the context of past elections. I mean, one way to look at the 2010 election is through the prism of Rahm Emanuel. In 2006, Rahm was the chairman of the Democratic Campaign Committee in the House. He did a great job of identifying districts where Democrats could make gains, recruiting good candidates, the kind of people who could wage a competitive race, making sure that they had the resources. Democrats took the House back in 2006, full 2 years before Barack Obama came to power. How'd they do it? They won seats that ordinarily they wouldn't win, Democrats wouldn't win, in the Upper South, in the Ohio River Valley, in the Rocky Mountain West. Now, Rahm has left his job. He's headed back to Chicago. A lot of Rahm's Democrats from 2006, a majority of them, in fact, of the first-time Democrats elected that year, also leaving their jobs. If history holds, they won't be going back to their home districts. They'll be staying in Washington, D.C. as lobbyists or Politico columnists or what have you. But look at the Rahm Democrats and look what happened to them when they were previously running under the best of circumstances. Now they're running under this past year they ran under the worst of circumstances. The disaffection of the center with freak show politics, I believe, is why we have so many elections, cycle after cycle, where the pendulum does shift. We've got a radicalized center that does not like this brand of politics. They fundamentally want a politics of maturity, a politics of problem solving, a politics based on principle but not on drawing sharp ideological lines. They don't get it, so they're chronically disaffected and chronically up for grabs in the political debate. And that's why I very much agree with both speakers that the idea of if somebody tells you, oh, what happened in 2010 is so important, it's going to influence politics for the next generation. It's total BS. Our politics right now is a jump ball. If you read of that, somebody saying, oh, this is a seismic change, you should report them to the American Association of Pundits. They've got a hotline, toll-free line, because it's total nonsense, and they should have their pontificating license at least temporarily suspended, in my view. And I've made this, I'm a recidivist, I've done it myself. Oh, this is huge. It is huge in terms of its short-term consequences. We can't say anything about its long-term consequences. Final observation about this, the reason that journalists and I think also a lot of political scientists fall for this is that in the past, it was true that you could think of politics, I think, in somewhat geological terms. The tectonic plates only shifted so often. The New Deal would create a group of democratic coalition that might last for a generation or two generations. Reagan's election was the solidification of a new conservative coalition that was a long time building. I just don't think that our current politics we can think of in geological terms anymore. We should think of them in meteorological terms. There's always some new storm building off the coast. It's one hurricane after the other. And so you got to hunker down for these hurricanes, but you can't make long-term assumptions based on them. So anyway, that's my thought.
Great. Well, that's a great start. The rest of the time belongs to all of us. So there's a microphone there in the back, and I hope someone will stand up and address it so that we can have an exchange. I'll start with a question, John, based on something that you raised about the nature of the freak show, which you said also acts on the media in similar ways it acts on politicians. And we didn't really talk very much in this discussion about how the media has performed during this period. So would you address that? And maybe, both of you, you run a publication and you run your show. You have competition that even, dispassionate observers would place somewhere further away on that axis from where you are. Do you find yourself under direct, constant pressure to do that? Do you fall into it? How do you avoid it? And can you maintain your position of influence without rushing to the corners?
It's a really good question, and the one I was certain would come up. I wasn't sure that it would come up so early from you, but it's a great one. Nobody who's a leader in media these days, whether it's at a new publication like Politico or established ones like our old home at the Washington Post or a place like CNN, can be immune from these incentives that I've described. There's just no question. I can look at our traffic and see what happens when we've got a Sarah Palin story that's on the site. We can't be fully insulated, but I do think we can bring analytical detachment and a critical eye to our coverage of politics. And to me, the great challenge for our generation of journalists is to defend and vindicate traditional journalistic standards in a wild, totally transformed new environment. How do you bring the defend and vindicate the best of the journalistic ideals that brought us into this business, even as you recognize that, it's not 1985 which is when I started journalism at the Washington Post. We don't always, the collective we, I'm happy to talk about Politico specifically, the collective we clearly does not do a good job at this task. There was an interesting study that somebody did that looked at network broadcast news coverage of the 2010 election. I suspect that it would extrapolate very easily to all of cable coverage. Looked at the top 3 races in terms of getting media coverage. What were they? One of them was Nevada. Now, that's perfectly defensible. He obviously got the Senate majority leader in the fight for his life up against a very provocative Republican opponent in Sharon Angle. The other 2, one of them was Delaware, where Christine O'Donnell was running. That race, as soon as Christine O'Donnell was nominated, that was never within single digits. The outcome of that was a foregone conclusion. And you can't say that that was a race with broad national substantive implications. It simply wasn't. It got more coverage than any other Senate race in the country this year. Why? Because you've got a flamboyant and outrageous candidate in Christine O'Donnell. Never mind that she doesn't have a chance of winning. The other statewide race was in Connecticut, where you've got the woman Linda McMahon, the Republican, who, she attracted a lot of attention for 2 reasons. One, it's close to New York, so it's easy to, I think a lot of New York TV producers are oriented toward. But the main reason was she used to be the head of Worldwide Wrestling, and so it's an outrageous race. It attracts attention. Never a close race. Come on, that's supposed to be the race that deserves more attention than any of these others around the country. 1, 2, and 3. Delaware, Connecticut, Nevada. I think that says a lot and says something very negative about the way our business as a whole has risen to this challenge of making sure that we keep our eye on relevance as we cover politics, as opposed to simply chasing the incentives of the freak show.
I have to answer, huh? I am not a witch. But I do work in cable, which some people think is the equivalent. I think John makes an important point, and actually a profound point, about the challenge for our business. Like everything else in the world, technology is changing our business, and if journalism is that you cover events, or you cover it, whether it is an industry, or it is politics, or it is academics, that has been used very successfully, mind you, by places I don't work, to create a very loud, vocal, and highly successful business model. We are here talking about something that is in part a celebration of our First Amendment rights. And so I'm going to compliment those places on their aggressive and profitable exercise of their First Amendment right. And I don't say that sarcastically, I honestly don't. They are in some ways our competitors. In other ways, they don't do what I do. They do something very different. But they're successful at what they do, and they have every right to do it. Some of you may watch it. Some of you may watch it religiously. That's your choice. And so I'm not going to criticize them, even though I personally could never do what they do. I'm an old AP guy. I'm trained in, you explore 2 sides of every story. Actually, that rule's gone. There are way more than 2 sides to most stories. Sometimes there are 8 or 10 or 10 or 20. I think our challenge we do not want to get into an overdriven, celebrity-driven politics coverage. At the same time, if you work in television or you want to run a highly successful online operation, you need people to buy your product. So you need to make it interesting. So I think the challenge for, especially my business, given what most would consider to be our competitors, I honestly don't view them that way because I don't think they do what I do. But the industry, and some of my bosses view them as our competitors, so I'll view it through that prism, is that can you have conflict sells? It's a simple rule. Conflict sells. It's why people watch football. It's why you have teams. Conflict sells, whether it's ACC basketball or whether it's American politics. And conflict is important. Conflict is important. Which tax sets should we keep? Which should we throw out? If we're going to balance the budget, should we touch Social Security? Why are our kids falling behind? There are a lot of different ideas about what we should do about American education. So let's have conflict about something. That's what I think my challenge is. And if you want to bring in people who want to have a spicy argument, whether it's 2 people or 4 people or 6 people or 8 people, or 2 today and 2 more tomorrow, because you want to actually let it breathe a little bit and you can't cover it all, then I have no problem with conflict. I have no problem with a good argument. But let's make it about something. Let's not just make it, okay, who's a feisty conservative and who's a feisty liberal? Here's a stake, let's play gladiator. And that's what a lot of cable television, frankly, is. To John's point about being a recidivist, I'm not asking for a gold star. I'm guilty as charged on some of these issues. But I try, and sometimes I succeed and other times I don't, to make that the test. I think especially if you want to defend journalism principles in this new world, it's hard, number one. Number two, even if I'm near perfect, nobody's perfect, I need you. You have to care for it. If you don't care for it, it doesn't matter how good I am. And number three, I have 2 tests that I hope if I pass them a majority of the time, I'll succeed. Is it value added? You can get information right now. Some of you could be sneaking a peek at your iPhone or your BlackBerry or whatever it is. Anyway, you can find out what happened. You don't need to tune in any time of day to find out what happened. You can find out when you want, how you want, where you want. So I need to give you something value added. Why did it happen? What was the secret to it? What's the context to it? What does it mean about tomorrow? Whatever, but to give you something value added about what happened to make you interested in it, and it has to be relevant to your life. John's point about Christine O'Donnell is dead on. That's one of the cases where, to the point about polling, which is a conversation worth having, we had very good polling from reputable firms that told us that race was gone. So come back if it gets close again, or if something happens. It was interesting that she beat a guy who had won 12 times statewide. She was a story. But 2 weeks later, she wasn't. 10 days later, she wasn't. But I'm not a witch. It's pretty cool. And so our job is, look, I can't ignore that, but don't start the show with that. I have an hour of television. Put it 40 minutes in. Say, have you ever seen this on television before? An ad where somebody looks straight in the camera and says, I'm not a witch? I think that's worth showing people. It's not worth spending 20 minutes on. So I think value added and relevance is the test, especially of television journalism going forward. Because one of the things we do in our business too often is insult the intelligence of our consumers. And if you don't want to have a conversation about Social Security and Medicare and whether the teachers' unions are too strong, whether the government should do something about climate change, whose job is it, what's too much government, where's the line? If you don't want to have those, if I can't convince you those are interesting conversations by making them interesting conversations, then they should send me back to bartending. But I think you care about those things, and it's my job to figure out how to have conversations about them in a compelling and sometimes combative way, because that does make better television. You will stay longer, even if you sit there saying, I don't want combat. All the research proves you stay longer if it's combat. But you have to make it about something, not just combat for the sake of combat.
Yes, we have a question here. Would you tell us your name?
Sure. Hi, my name's Helen, and I'm local. And I realize that you're agree that change is scary. And certainly, I remember the second part of the Clinton administration where small incremental change was important, like things like school uniforms, things that were not scary for a lot of people. And I think in this past, in the previous election, they got Obama to be sort of looked at as somebody from Hawaii, as the other, somehow not related to most American values. I'm wondering, when you said that you can see, Sarah Palin as a potential lead contender against Obama, since most Americans are for the right to choose and authenticity is very important, I would find it hard for a lot of American women to identify with a gun-toting, moose-shooting, candidate, somebody who also doesn't believe in the right to choose. I think I'm correct on that. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure.
Because to me, she seems of another world, and I know Hawaii and Alaska both came in later, but she does seem quite foreign. And I think for most people, they think she doesn't represent their values.
Alaska is different. You are correct at that point. Having been there several times, it's beautiful. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong. I would say this, yes, a majority of Americans favor abortion rights. When you get below that threshold statement, and a clear majority, I think it's up close to 60% now, it's certainly above 55%. When you get just below that, if we're going to get into parental notification, parental consent, should the state regulate, should the federal government regulate, you'd get a little bit more of a mix. But to the basic premise, yes, you're absolutely right. But George W. Bush was elected twice. Once was sort of close. And, you know, we don't need to revisit that. But, you know, rules are rules, and the Supreme Court got the final word, and he was president of the United States. And then when he was reelected, he won a majority, just barely, but he won a majority. He won 50%, 51% of the popular vote, and electorally, he won pretty convincingly. Would it be a different election if a majority of Americans believed that abortion rights were at stake, were at risk of being repealed? That might be a different election. I don't think anywhere near a majority of Americans think we're at that point. And if you want to project a little bit, the current president, we'll see what happens in the Senate, the current president is going to get at least one more Supreme Court nomination, I think, although you know all those Republicans are going to hold on. But the balance of the court, Americans are smart enough to figure out that even the Chief Justice, appointed by George W. Bush, has said that, while I think it's pretty clear from who he is and his rulings that he would never vote for Roe v. Wade, he has said that it's the established law of the land, and to him, conservatism means you don't turn things over just for the sake of turning things over. So I don't think that there's no evidence, and especially in the next election, to Sunshine's point, you know, every economic projection is that we're not going to move much in the economy. God, I hope they're wrong. Just as a citizen, I hope they're wrong. But every economic projection is that we're going to be somewhere in the ballpark of where we are now. That growth is going to be somewhere in the area of 2%. 2% gets us a flat line. 2% gets you actually probably higher unemployment rate because of population growth and everything else. And I mean, the real unemployment rate in this country is around 15% if you count people who've just checked out and stopped looking, or people who have part-time jobs who want to work full-time. That's not going to change between now and the next election, which to me means abortion rights. A candidate who comes forward saying, elect me, I want to either reinforce or repeal abortion rights, or reinforce or, you know, absolutely forbid forever same-sex marriage, anything social and cultural, is going to be ignored because the #1 defining issue in the country. Now, Sarah Palin has her beliefs on those issues. We'll watch if she campaigns, we'll watch what she says. She's going to have a test in Iowa. I don't sit here and say that she's the Republican nominee. I sit here and say, based on the circumstances today, I see it as very hard for her to turn and walk away. She has a chance. There's a wide open Republican race. She can raise money. She can get media attention, and she has a slice. And she has a pretty hardcore slice right now, 20, 15, 20, depending where you look at it. And the way the process works is, #1 is Iowa. Suits her just fine. The Republican electorate. We're not talking about a general electorate. The Republican electorate suits her just fine. #3 is South Carolina. Suits her just fine. The challenge is, and this is the test for Sarah Palin, if you read the Sunday New York Times this week, she gets it. The test is to survive Iowa, even if you're perfect on the Republican Party issues, you got to do 10 or 20 or 30 candidate forums. That's the way they work it out there. They take it seriously, and good for them. And she's going to have to talk about nuclear weapons, and about abortion, and about gay rights, and about teachers' unions, and about everything else under the sun. And she knows that. If you read the profile, she's going to have to prove herself. Now, she thinks it's unfair, but she understands the challenge in front of her. I don't mean that she has to prove herself. She thinks that people have this unfair, negative opinion of her. She has issues with us. But I'm just saying, as someone who's done this for 25 years, if I were her, I just said that, didn't I? If I were her, just as a competitor, she's a competitive person, she's a politician. If I were her looking at the data and looking at the race, how can you not run? She's got a pretty good chance. She's a better chance than most of them. And the president right now, again, I'll say it again, and they've all said it, nothing today matters about 2012. I give you Ronald Reagan, I give you Bill Clinton, horrible first midterm elections, easy re-elections. But if the unemployment rate is going to stay somewhere in the 9 to 10, some people say it could go as high as 11% range, then the current president of the United States is going to be vulnerable. He is going to be vulnerable in the next election. So A one-on-one race, you get to be the leader of the free world. If it's 50-50, why not? Is she out of step with a majority of Americans on some issues? Yes, but I think you could make the same case about George W. Bush.
Is there anything to add to that?
I would just add to that in terms of thinking ahead to the primary, that it's so difficult for us to think now about how the primary is going to play out. And that we also ought to give credit to the primary voters on both sides. That the number one thing they're going to be looking at in casting a ballot is who's going to have the best chance of winning in the general election. And so, it's early still to be thinking what the competition's going to be.
There's somebody we don't know who's going to get in the
Exactly.
Republican race. We're looking at, we think Palin, we think Romney, we think Huckabee, we think Gingrich. There's somebody's going to surprise us. It could be a Donald Trump. It could be another CEO. And I'm going to just go a little crazy here. It could be a guy named Jeb Bush.
Sir?
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Doug Kenyon. Appreciate your all's comments. Play the freak show out a little bit. Predictively, I mean, how long does it last, and can we survive it? And by that, I'm really asking the question both in terms of politics and the media. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what are we going to look like as a country? What are the implications of the freak show for the nature and quality of the political debate, and frankly, our policies?
I'll take a cut at that. I've always been more of an optimist than a pessimist, in part by temperament, but I think history generally bears it out that there's always, every innovation in communication produces excesses. It takes a while for the system to sort of reach an equilibrium. Again, I make the point that the reason I think we've got a radicalized center is already people don't like that brand of politics. At the moment, the center's not been able to assert itself in any kind of definitive way against the extremes, but I think over time it will. I just think there's tremendous hunger. I think an independent presidential candidate, if the person existed with the resources, would be ideally poised to run and win in 2012. And the problem is it's coming up with who that person is. Michael Bloomberg says he's not going to run. And I think there's good reasons. He probably would have a tough time. He's really, I think once people looked at his positions, he wouldn't represent the center so much as be a more traditional Democrat, even though he initially ran in New York City as a Republican. But I mean, there's a hungry center. If you look at what Ross Perot did in 1992, by the general election, he had already pretty well established himself as, shall we say, like an eccentric political character. Dropped out of the race once, got back in, still got almost 20% of the vote. I just think there's tremendous hunger for somebody that can break free of what many people consider a corrupt partisan structure and a sort of corrupt overall political media culture. And I think the positive incentives ultimately will outweigh the negative. That's over the long term. In the short term, I do think it's one of the fundamental questions about how we look at politics right now. Within the Republican Party, there's this division. We're used to thinking of the divide within the parties as being ideological. Are you a liberal Republican or a conservative Republican? Right now, I think the divide in the Republican Party is not so much ideological. It's between a governing wing or a conventional politician wing and a media/activist wing. The media/activist wing is run by Roger Ailes, Rush Limbaugh, Sarah Palin, and probably Senator Jim DeMint. Those would be the most powerful forces, I think, within that media activist wing. Tremendous power within Republican politics to reward people that they like and agree with, punish people that they don't like. Saw numerous instances of them exercising this ability to punish during the primary battles of 2010, beating Senator Bennett, for instance, out in Utah. The media activist wing is at war with the governing wing. A good example of what they can do. Lindsey Graham, in an interview with Politico after the election, spoke out and said, what, as Republicans, we have to acknowledge we blew a chance to take over control of the Senate by kicking away elections that we should have won. Delaware, Nevada, I think he had Colorado in the list, where more mainstream candidates, he believed, would have put those races in the Republican column. Something virtually every Washington traditional Republican that I know thinks that. Lindsey Graham came out and said it on the record. He was savaged the next day on Rush Limbaugh's show. Savaged. So that is the tension between the media activist wing and the governing wing. But there are lots of people in the governing wing of the party, you know, they also feel that this election vindicated them. You know, if you even take the Senate, you know, for all the talk of the Tea Partiers, new Republicans coming into the Senate, Roy Blunt in Missouri, Rob Portman in Ohio. You know, even take Marco Rubio, who's a Tea Party favorite. He's really, I think he scratched beneath the surface. He's a pretty conventional politician, former Speaker of the House in Florida. These people are experienced politicians. They're not in their heart radicals. I think they are authentically interested in governing from a conservative perspective, undeniably, but they're not fundamentally radical figures who want to destroy the system. They want to work within it.
If I could jump in real quick, I agree. One point I have a little degree of difference is the idea that I think the mood is right in the country for an independent candidacy. I think one of the reasons Bloomberg's tone has changed so much after the election is that they studied very closely what happened in Florida, and that Charlie Crist, the former Republican governor, gets in the middle. Now, there are a lot of flaws to the Crist candidacy, and he sort of reinvented himself one too many times, but the fact that the two parties just, the base of the Democratic Party would not budge, and the base of the Republican Party would not budge, and the guy, he won 3 counties, or 4 counties, but he couldn't move the numbers, and the Bloomberg people publicly will never admit it as much, but they studied it very closely, including spending some money, some research, and they came away with that with a sour taste that it's doable in the short term because of the polarization. To the freak show thing, to John's point, look, we overgeneralize in our business too much, and 99.9% of these people who get elected are good, honest public servants who believe what they believe and actually, you know, have policy positions. I give you a guy who's become very controversial. He's been overshadowed somewhat by Jim DeWitt. Tom Coburn is a very conservative Republican senator, one of the few on the right. I said amen for Tom Coburn on my show one night, and the email I got from liberals was horrible. And I said, I'm not taking sides with him on any positions, but I said he had the courage to say, I don't want to raise taxes. But if it's the only way to sit around a table and talk about the deficit, as long as you'll talk about Social Security and Medicare, I'll be willing to talk about taxes. And I said, amen. Good for him. We need more people like that. I think the question is, do they make, right now, there's a short-term calculation of the Republican Party is, can we beat Barack Obama? And if they decide yes, then they won't do anything big. And the Democrats won't either. I'm not, you know, there's some Democrats have the Social Security, Medicare, depending on the issue. But there's 2 issues: the deficit and immigration reform. You know, both parties should want to get those off the table. And debate, we can argue forever about the details of either one of those. But will the Republicans risk a generational taint in the fastest growing segment of the American population to win one more election? They just might. They just might. Or will a Marco Rubio come to town and say, people, no, let's do this. We can pass the Bush, Kennedy, McCain approach that now McCain has run from. They could figure that out pretty quickly. There's a majority in the Senate. There's an overwhelming majority in the House. The Chamber of Commerce wants it as much as the AFL-CIO. There's no reason they can't do this except for short-term political gains. So we'll see. I'm a skeptic in the short term just because I think there's a calculation that let's run this out 2 more years.
All right, well, we have 15 minutes left and 4 waiting questioners, so we'll try to breeze through that. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. So my question is for John Harris. You mentioned the disaffection of the center to freak show politics, but I was under the impression that the point of freak show politics is to gain the attention of the center. I was wondering if you could just clarify that point for us.
No, it really isn't. The people responding to these incentives typically are doing so in order to attract the allegiances and the fervor of whatever niche that they've organized their politics around. And that's one overlapping phenomenon that we see in both politics and media. From my perspective in media, the era that Phil and I grew up in, big metropolitan newspapers, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, broad-based news organizations, the networks, the news magazines. In my view, that era is crumbling, and it's being replaced by niche news organizations. Some of these niche news organizations, like Politico, are niche by subject matter. Many of the niches are organized around ideological orientation. Fox News on the right, MSNBC on the left, and it's that's why what's happening in media and what's happening in politics do reinforce each other. The people that are responding to those incentives they do it because they're going to get cheered by Rush Limbaugh, or cheered by Sean Hannity, or cheered by Keith Olbermann on the other side. So no, I don't think the people are oriented around the center, they're oriented around the extremes.
Can I just ask a follow-up to that, Sunshine? I mean, is there data that shows, or evidence that shows, that the polarization in the media either accentuates the polarization in the electorate or reflects the polarization in the electorate? What's the dynamic there?
So one of the things I think is fascinating is there's, in thinking about the fragmentation of the media, is there is this concern that people only watch media that reinforces their own opinions. It turns out that that's somewhat less the case. The bigger concern, I think, in terms of thinking about American democracy is the fact that the fragmentation of the media means that the people who are interested in politics can go to your side. The people who aren't interested in politics, who are sick of all of the political bickering, can ignore it entirely. And so I think that's where the disaffection from the political process interacted with this fragmentation of the media becomes worrisome, that if what we have is people who are turned off by the political dialogue, they can just ignore. They can ignore politics. They go straight to ESPN and straight to TMZ and not get the political news that we used to just kind of accidentally encounter if we turned on the television set at 6 p.m. over dinner. We were forced to watch a news station, and so that's, I think, had consequences.
Yes?
Question goes to really how you choose stories to cover. And the media can obviously have a huge role in influencing. How do you keep your own opinions out or put them in when you're deciding, what stories to cover? Because there's only so much space in a newspaper or time in a segment, and that implications across our country.
It's a great question. It's always the defining challenge of our business, in the sense that at least all of us at this table come to the table trying to be objective. We don't take sides, but what you choose to cover is subjective. What you decide is on page one, as opposed and gets 1,000 or 1,200 words, or the lead of your program, and gets, whether it's 2 minutes or 6 minutes or 10 minutes. That's a subjective decision, without a doubt. How do you make those decisions? You go into a room, hopefully with a diverse group of people. Diverse in ethnic background, diverse in geographic background, diverse in areas of expertise. Some of them are better about the economy, some of them are better about maybe education, or you tell them, if you have, because we are much more of a niche business, we have CNN money, we have an international network, make sure those people understand, if you've got something over here that, because I'm in this lane, I might not see, ring the fire alarm, shake it. If it's that big of a deal, make sure you get our attention, and then you have a conversation about it, and you make a decision. I'm a Washington-based show. John's a political, based site. So you have sort of a simple rule in that, what's the president doing? What's the Congress doing? What's going on out? What's the big issues boiling up in the state? Maybe it's the Arizona immigration law. Some of it's sort of common sense. One of our challenges is to think more outside the box, I think, though, and to get back to the relevance. I think one of the things we've lost sometimes, especially with people out in the country, if you're based in Washington, is they think we speak a foreign language that has nothing to do with their lives. Now, in part, that's because the politicians are living the freak show that has nothing to do with their lives, and we're covering them. I think one of the challenges of our time is to keep your objectivity, but to lean a little bit forward with your experience, to say, this is a joke. Now, as long as you are as willing to say this is a joke when the D's do it and when the R's do it, and you're equal opportunity in saying, come on, people, to my point about saying amen to Senator Coburn, I was very clear. I said, I don't know if his ideas are right, I'm not endorsing any of his positions, but amen to him, good for him for at least being willing to go in the room and have a conversation about it, and to set aside his ideology. I don't feel that's sacrificing my objectivity, but I better, when somebody on the left does it, be just as willing to say amen too. That's as far as I'm willing to go. But there are different rules at different places. But it's the relevance question, I think, is important. But that's different people would come to different conclusions. If we have in the 24 hours of CNN, watch, Wolf Blitzer's on for 2 hours before me. He might have his top story might be different than my top story. He's a great friend and he's a wonderful journalist. We sometimes just come to different conclusions.
Okay, sir.
My question concerns the role of the facts, awareness of the facts, or the lack thereof in the 2010 election. Certainly one of the more striking and puzzling and pressing things to me, I guess. I mean, the Tea Party, after all, was tax revolt. I mean, historically. And I saw one number that 8% of the electorate understood that they had actually had their federal taxes lowered. 24% or something like that. Obama's a Muslim. So, you represent or act in media of communication, which presumably is, part of that would be getting relevant facts about government politics to the public. What's the breakdown there? I understand that there are a lot of actors who have a stake in spreading misinformation. Some of them run whole networks. You would like to have it counterbalanced. Has this been since most of the facts, and of course I guess my own bias is here, seem to favor the administration, is this a failure on their part to get relevant facts out there, or is it structural that somebody actually has to run the government and they don't have a television network 24/7 to ask everybody who comes on, do you think Obama's a Muslim? I don't know, but it's one would like to think that something about the media could actually communicate important, relevant facts. Pat Moynihan famously said, everybody's entitled to their opinions, but not everybody's entitled to their facts. So do you worry about a breakdown here?
I'll jump in. I worry about it every day, and I think part of it is within our control. That we need to double check our facts and report the facts. And if the president's, if we show a candidate saying, we need to send more Republicans to Washington because Barack Obama's raised your taxes. If that's a central part of a candidate's speech and we show that because it's part of their campaign and we cover their campaigns, we can't censor their speeches, then we should come right out of it and say, here are the facts. And put up a graphic, and hopefully, my business in television, I don't have your attention that often, or the segment's only 4 minutes long. What we try to do is, I tell you, or we show you on the screen, and please go to our website. There'll be 4 or 5 links there so that you can see, here's what the Heritage Foundation says, here's what the Democratic Party says, here's what the Republican Party says. Give you some choices, let you do some more further research if you want to do that. We need to do a better job of that, but part of it is, look, the president's not a Muslim. But in the age of the internet, I can't, nor can the government, nor can any of you police the internet. But I do believe in the end, to John's point about these things run in cycles, I do trust in the common sense of everybody in this room and all across the country. It doesn't mean there are some people who aren't going to say until the end of the Obama administration that he's a Muslim. But 99.99% of the American people will figure it out over time. If you read a blog or if you watch a show, you will get the fact that there's a bias here. There's something that doesn't seem right here. Maybe you'll keep watching it because it's entertaining, or you'll keep reading it because it's interesting, but you'll figure out the bias. So some of it is on us and some of it's on you.
I would just add that there actually, Tom, is a fundamental tension between the incentives that you talked about and the concerns that you have in the media. And that is the stories that are the most conflictual, the stories that are going to capture the most attention are the ones that have the extremist on one side, the extremist on other, and let the audience decide that the truth is somewhere in the middle. When there are times when I feel like the media has often failed in being concerned about setting the record straight as opposed to just being a way for both sides to have a voice piece.
I agree with too much agreement. We should take another break.
Thank you. My name is Diane Robertson. I live here. And I wanted to go back to the red map conversation that you all alluded to, which was the change in governorships and, of course, in the flipping of the number of state legislatures, North Carolina being one of them. And the parallels that I see to another time in North Carolina's history at the end of the 19th century when a coalition government that represented real change moving forward was unlawfully defeated. Not quite the same. We did have an election here. But the implications of that were much further than the short term that most of you deal in with media, which is it changed the trajectory of the state and the country for a long time. So I'm not as optimistic that this isn't a much more significant change than we had. And I just like to hear both the political scientists comment about that, because I think that there is something to that. And with that, I do want to say I take issue with the fact that the money was not as significant in the opposition as it, because in North Carolina, that made a huge difference in the state race at the electoral level. These counties never had TV ads and the kind of mailers that went out discrediting candidates that were on the other side, and that all came from money that was never there before. So I think that at the granular level, maybe not at the 30,000 feet level, but at the granular level where it really matters in terms of changing the electorate, it mattered a lot, and I'm sure it happened in other states as well. So I just think that the audience, needs to be aware that where the rubber hits the road, money made a huge difference in this state, particularly in the race that was conceded yesterday. Notwithstanding that the candidate didn't do himself any good in one particular instance, but if there had not been the money to run that ad for months, 24/7, I'm sure that election would have turned out differently.
So I heard there was one race that was decided by 46 votes. Absolutely not just money, but what the temperature was that day. I mean, there were so many things that could have switched the outcome that we do have to, I mean, certainly there are going to be cases in which a little bit of imbalance in the money can make a difference. And so I don't want to, at all suggest that there aren't such illustrations. It is the case, however, that when you're dealing with very high-profile competitive races, that money has very little incremental effect. On this question of, and kind of down the ballot in particular, I just want to second the things that John pointed out, is that's where, in terms of there being some stickiness in terms of policymaking, in terms of redistricting, that I think that is actually much more consequential than what it means for what's going to be coming out of Congress, frankly.
That didn't have the kind of conversation in the media.
Absolutely.
Right. We tend to cover midterms as a referendum on the president, which they are, without a doubt. And this was it was a historic presidency and a consequential first 2 years, and so that did take up most of the oxygen. To the point, John made an excellent point earlier that it slipped my mind in the conversation. To your point, because of the decline in most places, not all places, of local television doesn't cover politics that much. When they do, they cover the conflict parts of it. And B, a lot of the great newspapers in America at the state level and the urban level, big city level, that used to cover politics. When I first broke into politics as a kid covering the Dukakis campaign in '88, I was 24 years old, and what I loved was you'd get off the airplane and you'd buy the paper. And you'd find out what was going on in the state. And I'd go back and read what's going on with the school committee, pull out the local page and read, because that's what motivates people. We always think it's about these big things. It's what's happening in their communities motivates people. It's gone. It's dying, and it's a sad thing. But if you don't like what happened in your election, whether or not us nationally or locally, your media could have done a better job covering it, there's another one in 2 years. And my hope, just as someone, a student of the game, is the more people who play, the better the fight. And then you'll be less, maybe less, I don't know what the right word is, disappointed or whatever, as long as everybody comes to play. But the R's won, and they won convincingly at the state level everywhere. We could argue the reasons forever. A lot of it's the bad economy, a lot of it's the national mood, a lot of it's they kick incumbents lose when the economy's bad, but there's another one in 2 years. It will be a different map, and that's a tough consequence. You're right about that.
But that map, I would say that's one of the big things to keep an eye on over the next couple of years, is how Barack Obama reckons with the post-2010 map. The 2008 map was dramatically different. Showed a Democrat playing, as I said earlier, all kinds of places where Democrats typically don't play. The Upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Rocky Mountain West. The 2010 map looks very much like the map of the previous generation, where you've got certain parts of the country that look solidly Republican, got certain parts of the country along the coast where Democrats thrive, in the Northeast and along the Pacific coast, and a handful of states that are up for grabs, Ohio, Florida, all the ones that you're familiar with. One question that I have, that I think we haven't seen Obama answer yet, does he want to spend the next 2 years fighting to broaden that map again and play in these places where the Democrats did not play well this year? If so, I think that sends him in one direction. Like he's clearly got to position himself more to the center. Or does he say, look, the map is the damn map, and with a bad economy, there's only but so much I can do. My fate, whether I get a second term, is going to depend on Ohio and a small number of other places. That might send him a different direction, more toward figuring out what is the traditional Democratic coalition, labor, the urban vote, how can I max it out? And you know, I'd be surprised if losing an election, I've seen it, and John saw it with the Clinton crowd. It's kind of like going through the stages of grief. You go through from you know, denial to anger to acceptance, ultimately action. It's very early for the Obama White House in their own stages of grief. I really don't think they know what to do yet. That's one of the questions that's there to be answered. Are they going to try to fight once again to have a broader map? Are they going to make decisions basically reconciling themselves to the fact that they've got a narrow map?
I'd just like to ask one more question, even though we're sort of out of time, because it's so unusual to be sitting with a journalist who's actually hiring new journalists. And you know, we're at the end of a decade where about a third of the people who were working in journalism in 2000 are no longer working in journalism. So there's been a massive remaking of that map as well. And John, you know, Politico's now gone through 2 elections, big elections. Where do you want to be as an organization 2 years from now, even in content too, where you're not today? And in what sense, how are you going to ride out this freak show so that in 2012 you're exercising a healthy influence over the discussion?
Right. A couple of quick points on that. Our aspirations at Politico are not modest, but we feel like we've had enough success in the 4 years that we've been in business to justify an ambitious mindset. We want to be either the dominant or one of a small handful of dominant news organizations in Washington. That's our aspiration. In certain places, I think we can make a credible claim to have already achieved that. We've got more people covering Congress. They're everywhere the important story is up on Capitol Hill. We've achieved that. Our White House coverage is taken seriously. Our national campaign coverage is taken seriously. Where we fundamentally want to grow is in Washington at the intersection of politics and policy. And that's where we're making most of our growth. It's highly substantive stuff, by the way. But for us, it's important. Incidentally, that's one reason why Politico, it's so easy for us to enjoy the circus and the carnival of politics and either cover the freak show or occasionally indulge in it, but really on an extracurricular basis. Our credibility as a publication and our business future as a publication depends on being essential reading within Washington and within the power establishment in Washington. I love the fact that we might get a big California readership, or we even have a pretty big readership abroad, about 5%, from people who just like American politics want to read about it. It's really the center of the concentric circles of our audience that our future depends. We only work as an editorial proposition, we only work as a business proposition if we're must reading within Washington. That dictates a level of seriousness and substance, because if we're not delivering on that bargain, everything is lost. So that's where we want to be. Quick point, the simplicity in your question, what are the incentives that young people who are interested in journalism, what should they be responding to? In fact, I hired several dozen journalists over the past 4 years, many young people, really talented journalists. For whatever reason, aren't downbeat and hangdog about the future. That's more for the people like us in mid-career thinking, gosh, what's the future hold? For whatever reason, these people are like, I love it, I want to do it. And they're like macabre, something will come up. And in fact, something does come up. But the future always reinvents itself. So these people are very optimistic. It's great fun to hire them. The challenge for our generation of journalistic leaders is a lot of these people, because they didn't grow up doing summer internships, they haven't worked in the Providence AP Bureau, they didn't cover cops and courts or what have you at the Boston Globe, they didn't work in the Fairfax County Bureau of the Washington Post. They have ambition, intelligence, but they don't have a traditional sort of journalistic grounding. And there's no question that the dynamics of the business force people, including young journalists, into specialization much earlier than in the past. In the old days, to thrive as a journalist, you were a generalist. You could spend some time covering, say, education policy. If you did well, you might get sent to the Paris bureau, and then you'd come back and maybe do an editor, and maybe go out on the campaign trail. The best journalists were generalists, typically. Now that's not true. Much earlier in journalist careers, you're being forced into niches. Just as publications have niches within the publications, individual journalists have niches. And to be honest, that's the only way that you can have, I think, a successful long-term career in journalism. You have to make yourself a franchise in some way. Journalism will always be a great career for people in their 20s or early 30s. You get to hop on airplanes, you get to tell interesting stories at the party, because you're always doing, meeting interesting people, covering fun stories. And you're learning a lot of things that are transferable in a whole bunch of different other ways. In general, it is not a good career once somebody reaches that, say their early 30s, unless they're really at the top. And therefore, I bring some special value. I'm a franchise, and if you don't want to hire me, the New York Times does, or the Wall Street Journal does, or some new website does. And if you can command that kind of interest, if you have that kind of leverage, then it's a rewarding career. But for people just below that rung, it's not. And that's different than what used to be the case. It used to be if you were like a pretty good journalist and you managed to get hired at the Boston Globe or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, you didn't have to be at the top of those organizations to have a respectable, prosperous, satisfying career. I think that's not true anymore, because the news organizations can't deliver on their end of the bargain. It's up to every individual journalist to basically manage his or her career using the sort of leveraging power that comes from their particular franchise, their particular distinctive set of journalistic skills. Everybody's got to market himself or herself. That's a longer answer than you wanted, but
that's a great answer. Well, I want to thank this really excellent panel for your work today and your thoughts, and thank all of you for spending so much of such a beautiful day inside with us. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon.